The Spin-off Podcast Network.
I'm Toby Manhire, and this is Juggernaut, the story of the fourth Labour government. A podcast in 6 parts.
Doesn't give my opponents much time to run up to an election, does it?
This nation is at risk.
What do you think you're up to now, you perverted little liar?
I could smell the uranium on it as you lean towards it.
There's a radical overhaul in the history of New Zealand's administration.
Juggernaut, the story of the fourth Labour government. Made with the support of New Zealand On Air. Listen now on The Spin-off or wherever you get your podcasts.
Talofa lava. I'm Madeline Chapman, editor at The Spin-off. If you have the means, consider supporting our high-quality journalism by becoming a Spin-off member. Sign up now at thespinoff.co.nz/donate.
Kia ora, this is Toby Manhire with a special global edition of Gone by Lunchtime. I just returned from the Philippines, a fascinating place to visit at any time with its sprawling, dramatic, political and cultural history. But right now it feels especially interesting, and that centres on a strange, evocative, cinematic rust bucket of a ship which is grounded out in the West Philippine Sea and or the South China Sea, depending on your perspective. The BRP Sierra Madre, an old World War II ship, was grounded on the Second Thomas Shoal in 1999, and that ship has been home to sailors since, sitting out there perched kind of delicately, corroding on a rock. In 2016, a Hague Arbitration Tribunal backed the Philippines for its claims in this part of the South China Sea, which is, of course, a massively important strategic part of the world. Shortly after that, Rodrigo Duterte began his presidency in the Philippines. He's most famous for the draconian law and order crackdown, but also he led a pivot towards China and away from the US. In 2022, Ferdinand Bongbong Marcos was elected. That's the son of the dictator Ferdinand Marcos, incredibly, and he pivoted back towards the USA. In recent weeks and months, the Chinese Coast Guard has been targeting efforts to resupply the Sierra Madre using water cannons, machetes and other weapons. At one point, a Filipino sailor lost a thumb. It's a real powder keg situation out there. There's real concern that if something goes wrong, if a Philippine sailor was killed, say, that would trigger the US-Philippines military treaty, and then things could really kick off. Marcos recently warned that the killing of any Filipino in a willful act by a foreign power in the South China Sea would be, he said, very, very close to what we define as an act of war under the Mutual Defense Treaty with the US.
The president of the Philippines is hitting back at Beijing after a clash with the Chinese Coast Guard that left several Filipino sailors injured. The incident took place near the Second Thomas Shoal in the disputed South China Sea. President Ferdinand Marcos Jr. said his country would not be intimidated and would not yield to any foreign power.
I was in Manila at the East-West Conference as a guest of the Asia-New Zealand Foundation, to whom many thanks. One of the guests at that conference, who was in fact honoured as a journalist of courage and impact, was John Nery. I sat down with John, who's a columnist and editorial consultant at the news site Rappler, the one which Duterte infamously sought to shut down, most closely associated with Maria Ressa. John and I talked about the South China/West Philippine Sea flashpoint, about domestic Philippines politics, which have been intriguing lately with Sara Duterte, the vice president, in a sort of double dynasty alliance in the palace. She quit cabinet a few days ago. And also we talked about media freedom in the Philippines. So, John, thank you for your time. It's interesting being here in the Philippines at the moment. Mm-hmm. There is a lot of talk here and in the international press about the situation in the West Philippines Sea or the South China Sea, depending on which part of the world you are, how you describe that. That's not new. That's been happening for a long time, but it does feel like it's heating up. Is that fair?
Yes. That's because we have a relatively new government which is taking a harder stance against China. The previous government essentially saw itself as an ally or a dependency of China. So in 2016, we won a historic arbitral award that essentially threw out China's very ambitious claims to most of the South China Sea, including that part which we call the West Philippine Sea. But under the new government, we did not push that award. In fact, one of the very first instructions of the new government then, in July 2016, was, and I quote, to give the Chinese a soft landing. They didn't want to ruffle any feathers, right? Because it turns out that in their reading, China was too important a regional player for us to push our claims too strongly. Unfortunately, that meant that over 6 years, from 2016 to 2022, because we weren't assertive with the award that we had already received, our position weakened. We were not able to build enough resources, enough naval or maritime or Coast Guard resources, for instance. And then we have a new government, which, I must be completely candid, surprised me. I thought that they would continue the pro-China policy.
So they didn't campaign on a shift in priorities?
No. And because the Marcos family is partly famous for its relationship with China, their father had opened diplomatic relations with China. Their mother, who is still alive, was a friend of Chairman Mao's. Many people thought that the relationship with China would be a special relationship. But they've changed. We've stopped the so-called pivot to China. And I think it's because of this that we're seeing more assertive actions from China. They, I think, are testing our resolve.
Can you explain to people what is being disputed? I mean, I think the one that is the most fascinating of many examples is the Sierra Madre. Can you explain what the Sierra Madre is and how that fits in?
So that's one of the things that we lay claim to. So it's not, part of it is sovereign territory, but most of it is territory where we have sovereign rights, which is a different, although related thing. There are several islands out there to the west of the Philippines, of the Philippine main islands. One of them is what we call Ayungin Shoal. And in the 1990s, we made the decision to beach a very old Navy ship. So it ran aground. It was run aground deliberately. And that has been our outpost. It's a military outpost in that particular shoal. And it's proven to be a flashpoint in the last few months because it's a decrepit ship, rotting stuff all over. It needs to be reprovisioned, and the staff need to be rotated every so often. So it's these rotation and reprovisioning runs that provide China with an opportunity to intervene, to harass, and that's where a lot of the news stories that we're seeing come from.
Because the Chinese Coast Guard, as they call it, are out there patrolling. That's
right. It's important to understand that China has it's not just the People's Liberation Army Navy. In fact, they hardly use the Navy. They use the Coast Guard, but they also have their maritime militia. So it's a different beast altogether. But it's the Coast Guard and the maritime fleet, which are non-military, that do the actual harassing. That's to prevent it from escalating into an armed conflict.
To a full military, and yet there have been clashes that included, I think, one Filipino soldier lost a thumb?
That's right, yes. The dismemberment, you might say, was an accident, but the entire operation by China was a deliberate attempt to interrupt the rotation and reprovisioning of the Sierra Madre, the rotation of the staff and the reprovisioning of supplies for the Sierra Madre. And in that clash, there was that accident, and that sailor lost his thumb.
And you mentioned President Marcos, Ferdinand Marcos Jr.
That's right.
And the surprise to some extent that there's been that shift back towards, because of course the Americans were involved in the removal of his father from power, weren't they? What has led to him shifting that level of support to the US? What lies beneath that?
Yes, so I come from this particular background where I shared in that view that he would be closer to the Chinese. And so I was among those who were surprised when he pivoted back to the United States. I think that what's really driving the Marcos family and the president is need to rehabilitate their family name. And I'm beginning to realize that the road to rehabilitation runs through the Western capitals. I think it's important to them long term. It's an extended family. They have, they have properties abroad. Many of them in Western countries. Of course, many of them are also disputed because of illegal wealth charges and so on. But it seems clearer to me now that they want to be in the good graces of these Western governments. That's how they define, in part, what it means to be rehabilitated. It's no
small thing though, is it? Because, I mean, just yesterday Beijing issued a statement saying that the Philippines was guilty of provocations and condemning their willingly acting as a pawn of the USA. I mean, there is a real danger of being caught in this clash of great powers.
Yes, and I think not enough of us in the Philippines have thought through our close relationship with the Americans. We shouldn't choose a particular path, whether it's led by the Marcos family or not, simply between China and the United States. We need to define our own interests. I happen to think that our own interests are best served with the Western Alliance. But it doesn't mean that we follow them blindly or they define the terms of the relationship. We need to define for ourselves the terms of our relationship. It's important for me, for instance, and I think for many Filipinos, that we feel that if something is done wrong to us by Washington, D.C., we can find ways to, raise hell in the United States. There are probably 3 to 4 million Filipino Americans there. We have very close ties with some of the U.S. politicians. In other words, and then we share same values of liberal democracy and so on. So it's not far-fetched to think that the United States, maybe in its zealousness, will do something that will run counter to our own interest. I don't know if you read the recent Reuters report, I think it came out just last week, that showed that in the time of Trump, the Pentagon ran a disinformation campaign in the Philippines, which I think were trying to convince Filipinos that Chinese vaccines were not effective. It was part of a larger geopolitical playbook, but certainly that was not in our best interests. We already had problems with vaccine hesitation. So it's important to realize that the United States has interests which do not necessarily coincide with ours. So we need to define for ourselves, right? What are our interests here? What do we want? What do we need? And then work with our partners.
The situation in Philippines politics is fascinating, and the names that recur, because Marcos, the name people know, the Marcos, Duterte, which obviously that was a leadership a presidency that caused ripples around the world. It was a very, but the name Duterte is still in the administration. The daughter, Vice President Sara Duterte. How did that come about? How did we end up with a Marcos and a Duterte at the top of the administration?
I think first of all the problem is structural. We don't have strong political parties, so essentially it's powerful political families that serve as political parties. So the Marcoses, even though they were ousted in 1986, managed to preserve their local bailiwicks in northern Luzon. The Dutertes, since the Marcoses were ousted, turned Davao City, one of our largest cities in the south, into their own bailiwick. So they are, in a sense, their own little political families. The union of Marcos Jr. and Sara Duterte was brokered by members of the Marcos family, led by the president's sister, Amy Marcos, and an ally of Sara Duterte, the former president, Gloria Arroyo, right?
Another family name.
Another family name, that's right. She was, President Arroyo is the daughter of another Philippine president. So at the level of the elite, it's just a game of thrones between houses, between political houses. But how that union came about, they realized they were better off together. And when they did merge, it was game over.
And in the last few days, Sara Duterte has resigned as education secretary, or so resigned from cabinet. Does that suggest that is she preparing for a potential challenge at the next election? Still a way away, but is that something you think is that you can see on the horizon, a clash between Duterte and Marcos, or Bongbong, as he's called, for the presidency next time around?
Well, definitely. Marcos Jr. can't run for president anymore. We have a single-term presidency, but definitely Sara Duterte will run for president, and definitely the Marcoses will look for a candidate of theirs. I think Sara Duterte thought that she would be the candidate, but I think now they're beginning to see that Marcoses' pivot to Washington, D.C. Puts their own father in danger of being tried by the International Criminal Court, plus a few other things. And so actually what happened is that the resignation just formalizes the break. They have been at odds, at least for the last 6 months, maybe even longer. But the resignation, now Vice President Duterte is no longer expected to defend any policy of the administration. She had been criticized heavily for keeping quiet whenever there was an outrage committed by the Chinese. Because their family is close to the Chinese. Now, she has no official reason to open her mouth because she's split. So that's an advantage.
So she doesn't have the collective responsibility of cabinet.
The same that's right. So that's an advantage for her. But at the same time, the education department is the largest government bureaucracy. There are hundreds of thousands of teachers spread all over the Philippines. It makes for a great nationwide campaign network. By resigning this early, 4 years before the next election, she is sacrificing that particular advantage. So I don't know what... I actually don't know why she chose that particular day, June 19, to formalize the break, but maybe to give her enough time to prepare for the 2025 midterm elections. That's going to be a battle of... that's going to be a proxy fight, definitely.
And so if the relationship China versus the West was not a campaign issue, as promised, but what is the mood in the Philippines public? Do you have a sense of how do people feel? Is it a major dominating issue in the Philippines, the relationship with the US vis-a-vis China?
I think if you look at the survey results, the usual survey companies or firms have always asked questions like which are the most important issues facing the country. And even during Duterte's time, when he was a peace and order or law and order president, the top 5 or even 7 concerns were all economic: livelihood, jobs, inflation. And I think that's the same thing today. However, having said that, the surveys have also tracked a consistent majority of public opinion supporting a more assertive stance against China. Since at least 2012, it has been the surveys have been very consistent, showing the public, saying, no, that's ours. We should be more aggressive with our defense. We don't want to be seen as weak. And that has held. And so that is one of the failures of Duterte. Duterte was a very popular, in fact, the most popular president since survey polling began. But he was never able to convince the public that his view on China was the correct view. There has always been a majority, 70, 75% or more, of Filipinos saying, no, we should be more assertive.
More assertive in being neither one nor the other, but
No.
having an independent perspective.
Not so much independence. I think most Filipinos favor the United States.
I see.
So for them, it's a natural move for us to be closer, again, to the United States. More assertive in promoting our sovereign rights in the West Philippine Sea.
Kia ora, I'm Duncan Grieve, founder of The Spinoff. You can help us keep all of The Spinoff's award-winning journalism free for everybody by becoming a member today at thespinoff.co.nz/donate.
This is Climate Adaptation.
We are the Pōtiki of the Taiao.
And the words of those keeping the home fires burning.
It's more than just going along and planting some trees. You got to be able to defend that place to the end of your life.
We have the solutions. We just need to come back to the belief in ourselves as rangatira.
Join me, Nadine Hura, and Ruia Āpirehama, the Kopapa Korangi Series 2, Ahi Ka. Brought to you by Te Komato Te Tonga, the Deep South Challenge, out now on the Spinoff Podcast Network or wherever you get your podcasts.
Can I ask you about Rappler, where you've worked for a few years now? You've had a storied career around a range of areas. That gained international recognition around some of the pressure that the publication came under, Maria Ressa particularly. Still a relatively young, only 2012 I think it was founded, or something like that. What is how is Rappler today? Is it in good health as a publication, as a digital publication?
Yes, I think that the crisis has, first of all, clarified our situation. It's very clear to us what our purpose is.
Yes.
It's also clarified for us who our allies are, and there were many who came out in support of Rappler, especially in 2018 when the attacks from the Duterte government became too large to ignore. And the international celebrity of our founder has helped us draw business and business support and funding from grants and so on. It helps us to create a community that will sustain our operations. So, yes, I think, let me say this first as someone who worked for another news organization looking at Rappler. When Duterte ramped up his attacks against Rappler, I was still with the Philippine Daily Inquirer, and I wrote then that I thought he made the mistake of thinking that because Rappler was relative to the Philippine Daily Inquirer or ABS-CBN, a much smaller organization, that it would fold quickly. He did not take into account Maria Ressa's deep and widespread international connections, and also that creating a symbol would help galvanize support. So, So in some sense, he strengthened it. In some sense. Yes. The truth of the matter is that Maria Ressa, who's a visionary, would not be Nobel Prize winner if there was no oppressor to stand up to. So it was a very big mistake of Duterte's.
And when you say it clarified your purpose, lay that out. What is the Rappler purpose, the mission?
Well, first of all, is to do real journalism. You've heard the cliche, right? Speak truth to power. This is especially important in the light of what happened under Duterte. So our heroes, led by our national hero, Jose Rizal, they were not so much warriors, but writers, many of them writers. But one of the things they fought for against our colonizers, the Spanish, was a free press, right? So the free press is guaranteed in our Constitution as a right, And one of the things that Duterte was pushing was that the free press is not a right but a privilege. So he had this whole notion that was completely the opposite of our history. And I think it was very important for Rappler and other news organizations to push back and say, no, it's not a privilege, dependent on whim or caprice, but it's a right guaranteed to us. So just pushing for that right? But also, Rappler is based on a healthy respect for technology. So we've been quite innovative. And then lastly, Rappler believes in the power of community. So those three pillars, those are our purposes.
And what is the situation in terms of the level of freedom of the press in the Philippines? Last night, when you were presented with an award, which I'll come to in a moment, another recipient was Anne-Marie Pamintuan, who is the editor-in-chief of the Star. She spoke of having had 35 libel suits against her, presumably against the newspaper, which is a form of, I don't know the details of those, but I'm going to take a wild guess that that's a level of intimidation and a curb on the freedom of the press. How would you diagnose the level of freedom of the press in Philippines?
So it wanes and it waxes depending on the government. I've had a few libel suits myself, and I think I had the very first cyber libel case filed. But this was
what was that for?
Oh, we were not the only ones. We were among several news organizations that reported on the inter-family conflict of the family that runs a very influential religious sect. And the members were fighting each other, and we ran to cover it. But we were the only ones slapped with a cyber libel suit. And the cyber libel was like in different parts. But the thing is, and also with the Philippine Star, this is not to take anything away from Anne-Marie, but the Star and the Inquirer and also Rappler, we have our lawyers. Like I've been to our law firm many times, then they do the work and all that, right? So in other words, we can afford lawyers. The problem is that, especially in the countryside, it's very expensive to be fighting libel suits. And that's where it's a real form of harassment. Like here, we have a law firm on retainer, and they just, when I entered the Inquirer in 2001, I think we had something like 200 libel suits in different stages of the judicial process. But you can fight that off. But the problem is the smaller news organizations, it's going to bankrupt them. So you are right, definitely. Libel suits in the Philippines can be forms, very, very strong forms of harassment.
And what was it? How did the award was for Journalists of Courage and Impact at the East West Centre event. How did you feel when you learned that you were going to be in that company on that stage?
May I be completely candid? I was overcome with a sense of imposter syndrome. It's like I'm just a lucky guy who is able to write for a living and work with people he likes working with. I mean, sure, I assume it was for the very many columns I wrote criticizing Duterte, and unfortunately, internally in the Inquirer, something like 15 of my columns were not published online because they were trying to manage the fallout. So that was a problem. I'm of course honored. I actually tried to say no, but I thought that it was important also to recognize the work of the many other Filipino journalists who are just doing their jobs.
And in a perfect poetic moment, you received the award in the Jose Rizal room here at the Philippine International Convention Center, and you've written 2 books.
That's right.
Tell us a little bit, give us the very beginner's guide, because this figure in the history of independent Philippines, huge, a giant of literature and of activism and of politics. Yeah?
That's right, yes. And it actually took an international scholar by the name of Benedict Anderson in his very influential small book called Imagine Communities to make us realize just how important Rizal was, not only to Philippine history, but to world history. Because it turns out that Rizal wrote the very first anti-colonial novels in world literature. There was one other book which came out, which was written by a Dutch subject about Indonesia, and came out maybe 10 years before that, but it was written not from the colonized point of view. So we have a renewed appreciation for the role of Rizal as a pioneer in literature. But the thing with Rizal is, for us, we call him probably the most famous biography of him is titled "The First Filipino," because he belongs to that first generation of Indios, of natives, who were proud to call themselves Filipino. And obviously that's how we refer to ourselves now. So he's the first Filipino in the sense that he belongs to the first generation, but he's also the first Filipino in the sense that he is an example to us of what a Filipino can achieve. He did quite a lot. I mean, over the years, and in the end he was executed mainly for his writings. He was identified as the head of the revolution. The Philippine Revolution was ongoing at the time in 1896. He was not in fact part of it, but it was also a fact that the revolutionaries named him their honorary leader because of his writings. So it was a strange trial where you say, I may have inspired them, but I'm not part of them. But in the end, the Spanish court-martial found out that he did inspire the revolution, and for that sedition, act of sedition, he was executed. And incidentally, his tomb is where he was shot. It's in Rizal Park, and right in front of that is Kilometer Zero, which is where we measure, the Philippine highway system from.
Thank you. One last thing,
Sure.
just to go back to the West Philippine Sea. What happens next? What happens next in this powder keg, very delicate geopolitical situation?
I found out that there's this political or social science term called ratcheting, where things go up, but we'll have great difficulty going back down. And I'm afraid we're in that particular situation. Things are ratcheting in the West Philippine Sea, and it's very difficult to find a way to stop.
To de-escalate.
To de-escalate, that's right. So I think that China is determined to test our resolve, so they will keep doing things short of an armed encounter. So it was very interesting, for instance, that just a few days ago in the most recent clash, they had knives and bladed weapons and so on, but no guns or anything. That was the first time we saw that. Right?
This is the Chinese Coast Guard.
This is the Chinese Coast Guard, right? Now, we didn't have any of those. Well, they actually did confiscate our guns. I don't think there was any order at all to use the guns against them. So we can expect the Chinese to continue to test our resolve. Up to when will we say uncle, or Uncle Sam? And on our part, I think that the Marcos government is also seeing just how much they can depend on the military. I think they need the military to be a little more creative, to think more out of the box, so to speak, because we are running out of diplomatic options. I mean, you can only file so many notes verbal, and then nothing happens. So I think it will be a very tense next few months to see. I don't know what the off-ramp is. I don't see it going beyond this year, at least. I don't know. But it will be a very interesting next few months.
Are you curious about how business can be better? I'm Simon Pound, and I host Business is Boring, a podcast where I kōrero with some of the most interesting people in entrepreneurship, commerce, and making things happen. Tune in to Business is Boring every Tuesday, brought to you by the Spin-off Podcast Network in partnership with Spark Business Lab. Kia ora e te iwi, Te Aihe Butler here, podcast manager at the Spin-off. If you enjoy listening to our podcasts, consider supporting our mahi by signing up to become a Spin-off member at thespinoff.co.nz/donate. The Spin-off Podcast Network.